Hello everyone. Tonight, we begin with atmosphere. Silent, sweltering, mysterious, heavy, pressing against the skin like a layer of divinity sitting on your shoulders. You start to feel breathless, but you must keep your hands steady. Deir el-Medina, ancient Egypt, New Kingdom era, around 1250 BCE, where the tomb builders lived, worked, and stayed silent for 3,000 years to build the final resting place of the pharaohs. Before we begin, if you truly find this a peaceful place to hide in during the late hours, please like and subscribe, but only if you really want to. No pressure. Just like the rules in old taverns, you only stay if you need a quiet place. And you know what I love most? Looking at the comments, seeing where you're from and what time it is where you are. Whether it's New York or Norway, 1 a.m. or 5 a.m., you're still here, and I see you. Now turn off the lights, turn on a small fan if you have one, not because it's hot, but because of the soft buzzing sound, and join me as we step into the day of a tomb builder of the pharaoh, where one wrong chisel means a soul misplaced. You wake up, not because of birdsong or soft sunlight through curtains. In Deir el-Medina, birds aren't free to sing. They're too busy trying not to die from the heat. And curtains, you're lying in a mud brick room, walls thick as oaths, ventilation holes smaller than Anubis's nostrils. No curtains here. Your home is the standard Deir el-Medina type, mud mixed with straw, flat, sun-dried clay tile roof. 3 rooms, 1 for sleep, 1 for enduring heat, and 1 for arguing in silence. Your room has no windows, maybe because Egypt didn't believe in natural light, but rather in the silence of thick walls. The ceiling is so low, if you're taller than your chisel, you'll spend your life hunched over. You woke up because sand fell on your face, and maybe, as usual, it was the cat. In Deir el-Medina, cats aren't pets, cats are gods, and gods are never wrong. If a cat chooses to sit on your face at 3 a.m, you don't swat it away. You say thank you, because that might be Bastet, goddess of harmony in the home, or Bastet when she's pissed. People used to say, if you dare shoo a cat off your bed. The next day your house might turn into a grain barn, cursed by every neighbor woman in the district. Maybe it fell from the wall. Maybe your co-worker tossed it just for fun. Maybe divine Bastet just raked her paw through a pile of sand right above your head. No one knows. No one asks. Because in Deir el-Medina, waking up alive is good enough. You open your eyes. Your neck aches like a snake coiled around it all night. Your arms numb. Because it was your pillow. You move. Your knee pops. You don't know if that's bone or heartbreak. You don't remember how old you are. You only remember, today you must carve the scarab's head. The important part, the part that, if done wrong, will send the pharaoh's soul backward out of Duat. You exhale. The smell in the room is a mix of stone dust, dried sweat, damp straw, and old barley. An original Egyptian cologne only the poor get to smell daily. You hear footsteps outside, straw sandals dragging over sandy earth, lazy and resigned. The familiar mumbling of the old man sharing your house. If I carve the pharaoh's mother's name wrong today, then I'll just carve my mother's name instead. You chuckle through your nose. He says that every week, each time with a different twist. Remember Tiba? Mistook Osiris for onion ris. Now no one dares eat onions. Yeah, I remember that. We had to recarve the whole prayer line because of a single missing stroke. Just one stroke. If Pharaoh had heard, he'd have shaken his head. No one laughs. Not because it isn't funny, but because it actually happened. You stay still for a moment. Your mind lingers in the remnants of a dream. You were at the Luxor market, holding a basket of fruit, smiling at a gap-toothed pottery girl. You were about to propose. Then a goat ran by, and you woke up with a face full of sand. That dream, its colours, the fruit scent, the laughter, felt like it belonged to another world. A world with no stone dust in lungs, no backs bent beneath tomb ceilings, no daily question of who will vanish today for one slip of the hand. You didn't want to wake up, but the cat, or fate, gave you no choice. Good morning. You rise from the coarse mat, hit your head lightly on the low ceiling. Ouch. But still lucky. Yesterday, someone hit their head on an actual tomb ceiling while trying to carve reverse lotus petals. He got to leave early, meaning he went to Osiris. You step outside. Your feet touch cracked clay. The sun hasn't fully risen, but you know it'll soon pour down like Ra's fury. Your eyes sting. Your hands are numb. Your back throbs. You haven't done anything yet, but your body already remembers it's a work day. Your spine creaks like stone stairs no one has climbed in years. Your shoulders feel like they carried the statue of Ptah all night. Your fingers, every joint, every bone, wonder why they still exist. You're not old, but you're not young. You're just someone who's been used by time like sandpaper. You take a deep breath. It's still early, and don't let the morning mist fool you. This is not a gentle dawn. It's the silence before the Egyptian sun decides to roast every cell on your skin with the presence of God Ra. Morning air in Deir el Medina smells like sadness with legs. You are not a pharaoh, not a high priest, not a palace poet. You're the one who carves eternal words for those who won't know your name. You are a chiseler, and today will be a long day. You step out to the backyard. There is no running water, no shiny bronze basin, no mirror to check if your hair is standing up from a night of dust. There's a clay jar, not the kind of fancy jar you see in museums, but a cracked earthenware pot, half buried in the ground for natural cooling. Inside is water, or what used to be water, covered in a thin layer of moss like a forgotten memory. This water was carried from a well half a day's walk away. It passed through 3 households. It was filtered through kindness and luck. No one drinks it. No one washes dishes with it. No one touches it unless they absolutely have to. But every morning you bend over, like a penitent ritual, to begin your day with the liquid closest to baptism, in dust. You bend down, dip your hand, cold, murky, smelling of iron and ashes. You scoop and wash your face and awaken. Not awake as in alert, but awake from the illusion that today will be any easier to breathe. They say, whoever starts their day with clean water will have good fortune. You start with a grain of sand flung into your eye, because the wind just blew through the dusty alley behind the house. You don't groan, because if you make a sound, people might think you're hurt. And here, being hurt means being replaced. No one wants to lose their job because of one grain of sand. You grab a rag, wipe your face slowly, because the cloth has stiffened like sun-dried oxide. In the old days, they say, there was something called soap, made from oils and fragrant flowers. But here, sand is soap, ash is mouthwash, and salt, if you're lucky to have it, is used to wash hands, scrub feet, and pickle fish. You once saw your mother take fireplace ash, mix it with water from that same jar, and scrub your father's back when he came home smelling like a mummy in the hot wind. He said that day, "Smells like hell." Your mother was always the earliest riser in the village. Before the sky even turned grey, she'd light the fire, dry the cloth, pour ash into the hearth, and boil water scented with wild herbs. Sometimes it was fragrance, sometimes spirit-banishing medicine. She never raised her voice in the morning, just silently worked, then silently disappeared into the shadow of the wall. Each morning felt like a silent farewell between the living and those about to descend into the belly of stone. A fly lands on your neck, you don't swat it. Not because you're gentle, but because if you use energy now to swat a fly, you won't have enough left to chisel later. No one says anything while getting ready for work. No one wishes luck. No one looks anyone in the eye. Everyone knows, if you look long enough, you'll see the fear in someone else. And if you see it, you'll remember your own. And here in Deir el Medina, fear is something people wrap up and bury inside, like the dead wrapped in linen. So everyone just lowers their heads, works quietly, like a colony of ants walking into fire without a sound. Mourning in Deir el Medina feels like a silent ritual. Only the sound of dragging sandals, rope-pulling tools, and small fire crackling in a dry stove. You remember your father's words, who was also a stone carver. Never speak loudly before entering the tomb. The pharaoh's spirits are still asleep, and they hate noise. You don't know if that's true, but you believe it. Because yesterday, someone whistled while sharpening a chisel, and the next day, the ceiling where he stood collapsed. No one mentions him anymore. You adjust your belt, sling your tool pouch over your shoulder, and take one last deep breath. Before stepping out the door, you mutter the same words as always. No crooked lines, no wrong carvings, no talking in the chamber. Don't look into the statue's eyes. You don't know who taught you that. Maybe your father. Maybe the old carver who died 3 flood seasons ago. Maybe the wall itself. A silent prayer, not to the gods, but to the stone. Because the stone, in this place, hears more than men. The wind carries the scent of smoke, ash, and people who haven't bathed. No one prays. There are no drums, trumpets, or sacred chants. Just you, and a dusty morning where every step is a silent vow. The tomb chamber lies behind the rocky hill, a place sunlight visits only once a day, then leaves like a busy god. You and a few others walk in a line. No one speaks, no one coughs, no one is loud to yawn. The chamber swallows sound. Every footstep feels distant, as if you're entering a place not meant for the living. You stop at the entrance. A narrow slit in the rock opens up. No archway, no welcoming statues, just a crack in the mountain, and inside, darkness thick like fermented grape pulp. You enter. The air is damp, but not cool. It clings to your skin like old oil. Smells of raw stone, of wooden hammers, of people. You set down your tool pouch. You glance at the stone wall to the left. Near the base, knee height, there's a faded handprint, worn down by time until only half the palm remains. No one knows whose it is. No one dares to erase it. The master carver says it's from the first man to chisel this chamber. Others say it's the last trace of a carver who vanished last year. But you don't ask, because asking is for newcomers, and newcomers don't stay long. Inside your pouch is your tool set, passed down through 3 generations, or so you believe, since no one lives long enough to confirm it. There's a short-handled acacia hammer, round-headed, fits perfectly in your palm, its body chipped, cracks running like a map of memory. Each chisel has your name etched into it, not to show off, but so if someone grabs the wrong one, you've got a good reason to beat them within the tomb. You lost a chisel last year. It later turned up, snapped in half, lying in the sand, like a warning sent from the stone. Every chisel is sharpened on sandstone, hard as fate. Its edge is worn but never dull, because a carver doesn't need sharp tools, just a steady hand. To your left, the master carver is working on a line of hieroglyphs. Pharaoh standing before Osiris. To your right, untouched wall, smooth, cold, waiting. You reach for the hammer. Your hand knows the path before your mind does. Someone once said, stone has a soul. If you carve it right, it breathes with you. If you carve it wrong, it screeches like betrayal. You once heard a story about a mysterious crack. On a bright day, the tomb wall shook when a carver struck what they called the breathing vein of the mountain. Since then, no one touches that wall. They painted a red circle and avoid it like an unnamed curse. You're not superstitious, but since then, you always place your hand on the wall before carving, like a greeting or a silent request for permission. Every chisel stroke is a quiet declaration. Every tack that echoes a sentence carved into eternity. You don't dare make a mistake, not out of fear of scolding, but because one wrong cut will ruin every glyph that follows. Hieroglyphs aren't just symbols, they're ancient spells, incantations to guide a soul through the gates of judgment. An eye, missing a corner dot, turns from to see into to be watched. A crooked mat glyph turns justice into vengeance. The best carver is one whose chisel doesn't tremble while carving the names of gods. And if the glyph is wrong, the pharaoh's soul won't reach the Hall of Two Truths. You once heard a tale. A carver wrote Anchor, peace wrong, turned it into Ket, burning. And when the tomb was opened centuries later, the pharaoh's corpse still had a grimace. You swallow. No one sees you shaking, because your hand isn't. But inside, your chest tightens like a drawn bowstring. Hammer rises, chisel aligns, tack, a cut appears, Small, deep, clean, as if nothing ever existed there before, and yet it might stay forever. You work all morning, non-stop. Each worker here has an unspoken quota, 3 glyph blocks, 4 divine figures, and no missing lines. Some days you meet it, some days you exceed it, some days you spot a shadow by the exit, just counting the marks you make. Many think carving stone is labor. But here, it's a test of nerves. Too fast, they think you're careless. Too slow, they'll replace you. And being replaced means disappearing. Very politely, very quietly. Your eyes ache, your shoulders throb, but your hand stays steady. Because you know, here, immortality doesn't come from the soul, but from precision. You're not a painter, not a poet. You're the one who lets them pass through death without getting lost. And your job begins with a cut, just deep enough. No more, no less. Too deep, the stone will break. Too shallow, history forgets. And you're not allowed to be forgotten. It's just that no one is allowed to know who you are. In the heart of the tomb, there was a chamber no one named. No sign hung. No label appeared on the drawings. But everyone knew it was the silent room. Not because it lacked sound, but because no one dared make any. This was where the most important titles were carved. The full name of the pharaoh, his ancestors, his guardian deities, and, most importantly, the name of the pharaoh's mother. The pharaoh's mother's name wasn't just a family title. She was the one who passed divine blood to her son, the certification of his rightful inheritance. To misspell her name was no different than insulting the gods directly. In the unwritten rules of Deir el-Medina, that was a sin no apology could erase. You once heard the tale. A pharaoh was left off the worship tablets because his mother's name had one stroke intentionally missing. The result? That entire dynasty disappeared from the records for over 200 years. No one joked about it anymore. There was a joke everyone knew but never dared to say aloud. If you misspell a god's name, maybe you can apologize. But if you misspell the pharaoh's mother's name, good luck in your next life. Before being allowed in, you had to pass a silent test. Write the pharaoh's mother's name 10 times on a wax tablet using a wooden tipped chisel. If you made more than 3 mistakes, you were reassigned to the outer wall team. If the wax cracked, you weren't allowed in that day. Only after passing could you hold a real chisel, and only then could you step into the room, your heartbeat slowing as if being pulled by a rope. The air was thick, like someone watching from the dark. The only light came through a narrow slit in the ceiling, shining directly on the stone where the mother's name would be carved, as if the light itself knew where fate was etched. You heard the sound of hammer on stone, but no echo followed, as if the sound was swallowed by the rock and kept inside its chest. Many said this room wasn't a workspace, it was sacred, a small shrine without a god, yet heavier than Osiris's altar. Here, every strike felt like engraving on parchment made of destiny. An old carver once said, "When you carve in the silent room, don't think of your mother, don't think of your lover, and absolutely never think of fear. because stone listens. And if your mind wanders as you carve, the line will stray. And here, a stray mark isn't just a mistake, it's a wrong turn for the pharaoh's soul. So everyone who entered this room learned to seal their emotions, like sealing a sarcophagus. The only things allowed to remain, a steady hand and a quiet breath. No edits, no erasures. The first word you carved was Mut, the name of the mother goddess, the symbol of birth and death. You placed your chisel on the stone and whispered 3 times silently in your head, like a prayer. 1 stroke, 1 rhythm, 1 life. You remembered last year, a carver miswrote the N in the Queen's name. The word merit, beloved, became meris, rebuked. 3 days later, he requested to be transferred to the outdoor mortar mixing station. His face didn't change, his lips never opened. No one laughed, no one pitied. Only 1 sentence was passed down. He's still alive. But in the roster of carvers, his name has been crossed out. You didn't want that. You gripped the mallet tightly, focused so hard your ears rang. Sweat dropped into your eye, but you didn't blink. 1 stroke, 2 strokes, 3 strokes. You finished the first word, and nothing collapsed. You inhaled, as if breathing in a whole life. In a corner of the chamber, there was a tiny statue of Bastet the cat, placed on a stone shelf. They said, Bastet was the goddess who protected souls that wandered, and sometimes those who made mistakes, if their hearts were sincere. There was a rumor in the village, if you accidentally carved a stroke wrong, bow deeply before Bastet's statue. If it didn't fall, you would be spared. But if the wind blew and it trembled, you were to pack up and write your resignation before someone else wrote it for you. No one claimed the statue. But after each carver finished the pharaoh's mother's name, they bowed before it. No words, just a bow. You did the same, not out of superstition, but because a bow is cheaper than a mistake. The silent room had no words, only hands, and engravings that must never be misremembered. You return to the main corridor, the one carved with scenes of passing through Duat, where each wall is a chapter in the handbook for the dead who still have roads to walk. You carve monsters, some with snake bodies, human heads, and 6 arms, each holding a different knife. Others with bull heads, sun eyes, and voices that could wake a mummy if you mess up 1 eyebrow line. Each creature has a name. The longer the name, the more terrifying it is. The old master said, only when you call it by its correct name will it let the soul pass. Miss a letter, and it'll mistake the pharaoh for a fraud. Here, no flowers are drawn, no ornate patterns, only the road, the beasts, warnings, and the names of the gates. A young carver next to you whispers, what if I forget to carve the name of a monster? You don't answer. You just look at him. Then look up at the wall, at the half-finished snake with a human head, 2 arm spans long. The head's done. The body, not yet. But the eye is already open. If you forget its name, it won't recognize the pharaoh. And if it doesn't recognize him, it will bite. You're carving the path toward Gate 7, the gate of fire. Next to it, you see the small lines, the 42 declarations of innocence the Pharaoh makes before the gods' council. I have not killed. I have not stolen from temples. I have not acted wrongly while conscious, not just text. These are testimonies, vows. If one is missing, the Pharaoh is assumed to have hidden guilt. The master said, the soul is not judged by speech, but by what the stone remembers. So you carve each line as if transcribing a sacred trial, where you are the scribe, and the stone is a transcript that cannot be erased. Beside it is a line that reads, he who has no name has no form. He who has no form has no path. Every chisel stroke you make is a hypothetical step for the soul. If your hand slips, the road strays. If you carve wrongly, the form dissolves. You remember what the master said. The Pharaoh cannot walk if the carver does not carve true. Sometimes you feel you're no longer a craftsman. You are a guide for the dead, a map maker, drawing in bloodstone so the soul won't get lost. Amid the layers of shadow, you don't know who the Pharaoh is. You've never seen him, never heard his voice, but you know, if you err, he won't survive the bull-headed demon at gate 9. And if he cannot pass, this entire dynasty may fall with him. You carve the image of the Pharaoh raising his hand to greet Anubis. The Pharaoh's statue must not only look like him, it must be exact. From the tilt of the shoulders to the curve of the lips, each follows a formula. Carvers memorize the rule of 18 fists. From crown to heel must equal exactly 18 clenched fists. Add 1, he's taller than a god. Subtract 1, unworthy to enter Duat. The master said, the Pharaoh's gaze must face the light, never down. For a king's soul must never fear. You chisel the eye, adjust the light angle so the line curves perfectly into the left cheek. Each strike carries rhythm, part ritual, part fear, because you dare not stop. At the end of the corridor, you see the familiar image, a small scale, a single feather, and a human heart. You know this scene. Everyone does. It is the scale of Ma'at. You stop and look. This is the hardest scene, not because of detail, but because of feeling. You must carve a feather, light and sacred, and a heart, heavy and trembling. The scale must not tilt. All proportions must be exact. A carver once trembled while carving this scene and misaligned the feather. The image was taken down. The man was given 2 weeks to reflect. No one knows if he came back, because this scene wasn't just the Pharaoh's moment. It belonged to all of us. No one said it aloud, but every carver bowed their head while walking past. Not because of rules, not because of fear, but because this was the only place in the tomb that every one of us will one day walk through. At noon, the stone bell doesn't ring. There's no horn, no bell. Just the sound of everyone exhaling at once from across the tomb complex, like a stone beast finishing its hour of roaring. You drop your chisel, fingers trembling like you just finished playing an ancient melody on the face of stone. Lunchtime. You step away from the corridor, following the faint golden light from a narrow crack above. The lunch area has no chairs, just flat rocks, laid in rows, like graves for the living to rest a moment. You sit next to a young carver. Today's bread is hard, like every day. But you know what it's made of. Not white flour, not premium wheat. Just coarsely ground barley, mixed with water, lightly fermented, then baked on hot stone. And the beer, no foam, no chill. But this is real Egyptian beer, brewed from barley and raw yeast, cooled in clay jars, and only slightly settled before being poured into a leather flask. This is not a meal. This is tradition, the same thing your father ate. And his father too, under another tomb, chewing it with the exact same face. Everyone's food pouch is the same, but the way it's shared, no two alike. You see the master carver take out the only piece of cheese in his portion, break it in half, and hand it to the two apprentices. No one says thank you. No one refuses. Everything happens like it was written long ago. Here, people don't keep food for themselves, because if one eats too much, someone else will go hungry, and when hungry, your hand carves off mark, and if the hand slips, Pharaoh won't pass gate 9. A loaf of bread so hard, it could be used as an emergency chisel. A flask of warm beer, just enough to go down your throat, but not cold enough to pretend it's refreshing. A piece of goat cheese, if you didn't get cut from the ration today. You bite the bread. The crunch echoes like someone tried chiseling Seth's skull. You chew. Your teeth crackle. Not because it's tasty, but because you don't want to bring it home. The beer is warm. Warm like the belly of the sunbathing bull god Apis. You suddenly remember an old story about a young worker who once snuck someone else's cheese ration during food prep. The next day, the whole team's rations got cut in half. No one pointed fingers, no one spoke up. But the guy got reassigned, from master chisel to stone debris cleaner. He got the message, and never touched anyone's portion again. Here, everyone knows, taking more means taking away trust. You drink, feeling your stomach lighten, and your mind briefly forget the snake-headed demon you left half-carved. Someone jokes, lunch here tastes best if you've never eaten anything but sand. You smile, a smile with no reason, no logic, just to breathe. An apprentice asks softly, if we die while carving, can we be buried in the tomb? You don't answer, just chew. The master carver hears, but doesn't open his eyes. He only says, may the god Ptah let you outlive the chisel you hold. No one laughs, no one mourns, because here, death is part of the job, like the hammer, like the dust, like a lunch that's never cold enough. A master carver nearby sits with his eyes closed, back against a stone column, his hand still gripping the hammer. You don't ask why he doesn't let go. In Deir el-Medina, people sleep very little and rarely sleep deep. They learn to nap against stone, back curled like the curve of a hammer, head tucked on an elbow like a temporary bed made of willpower. They say, if someone sleeps and forgets to hold the chisel, they'll wake in the night to a whisper from the stone. No one knows where the voice comes from. Only that the next day, that person will carve wrong. So just to be sure, the worker never lets go, not because they fear losing the tool, but because they believe, as long as they hold it, they haven't left their role, because you know, Some dreams are only safe when your hand still touches the craft. Maybe that's how Deir el Medina workers keep dreaming. Not with blankets, but with what makes their hands ache every day. A stray cat strolls by. They say every cat in the village was once a form of Bastet, the goddess who protects harmony and limits. If a cat stops next to you, it means you're living rightly. If it walks away, it means you're using someone else's blessings. Long ago, a worker once threw bread at a cat as a joke. That night, his lamp went out for no reason. The next morning, the stone he was carving cracked in 3 lines. Since then, no one jokes with cats during lunch. They don't fear people, but they don't care about you either. It sniffs the bread pouch, then lays down between 2 workers, as if it's been doing this for thousands of years. You watch it, and for a moment, you think, maybe it really is Bastet, checking who's taking too much. You close your eyes. The beer is gone. The bread is still half left. The chisels have gone quiet, but your heart still hears the echo from the stone wall, as if Pharaoh's dream is still waiting for you to finish. After lunch, you return to the tomb after lunch. No one says a word. Every step is the same, heavy, slow, and full of stone dust. Now comes the hardest part, not because of technique, but because you've been assigned to carve the symbols of loss, not because they're beautiful, not because someone liked them, but because Pharaoh himself wanted them there, as a mirror to reflect his own image. A master once said, "This is the part few understand, but every king must remember, behind the throne is the abyss." The image of a man torn in half is not for others, it's for the king himself, so that when his soul passes through Duat, he must face the truth that he once made mistakes, killed, hesitated, and if he doesn't acknowledge it, he will become the very carving he sees, not the sun, not the lotus, not the protective eye, but people being sliced in two, soul thieves wrapped in snakes, headless corpses, symbols of those rejected by Ma'at. A master once said, "There are things carved that even the stone doesn't want to hold." You didn't understand what he meant until you began shaping the curve of a bound wrist. Your hand hurts, not from strain, but because you don't know where the end is supposed to be. You hear the chisel of the man beside you. It bounces off the wall and returns like a distant sob. You know, that's the punishment wall. Each dynasty had its own way of scaring lost souls. In this one, they preferred the image of a hyena with a human head, a creature not found in nature, not divine, not animal. The carvers called it the thing in between, a mouth in the dark that can smell guilt. There's an unspoken rule. When carving the hyena, you must pause 3 beats after finishing the mouth. No one explains why. Newcomers ask. The veterans stay silent. Just know, one apprentice didn't stop. The next day, his hands bled from sanding, but the stone never smoothed again. They said it had marked him. This dynasty chose to show criminals being torn apart by the human-headed hyena, bulging eyes, tongue touching the ground. You've just finished the left eye when the master walks by. He looks closely, then says, "Good, but don't make it too real. The dead shouldn't be haunted further." You see an unfinished slab, a woman's head bowed beside the scale of Ma'at, and next to it, another image, a kneeling man, hands bound with vertical cords, head tilted as if listening. No one knows who carved it, but everyone remembers the story of Menku. The carver assigned this part last year. They say, after finishing it, he began dreaming of himself in that pose, kneeling, tied, head tilted. Every time he picked up a chisel, his hands trembled, not from fatigue, but because it wasn't done. One day, Menku left the village. No farewells, no questions. But since then, no one carves that section alone. No one wants to claim it. No one knows who it is. Some workers believe it's a female soul being judged for breaking a sacred vow. But one master says it's an image of sorrow, not punishment. He recalls when he was an apprentice, they carved something similar to depict a spirit that couldn't pass Ma'at's scale. Not a criminal. You listen and don't know who to believe. You only know whether it's judgment or grief. The carving must be gentle, because stone doesn't know right from wrong. It only remembers what's deep enough. Others say it's a slave who died fleeing the tomb. You don't ask. You just bow your head and keep carving. Some choose to lighten the symbols through hand, through eyes, through thought. They reduce the details, soften the outlines, leave out blood splashes or snake tongues. A master once said, if someone can draw pain without adding more fear, they have enough compassion to do this job long term. Not everyone agrees. Some overseers punished for lack of precision. But the carvers who last the longest know when to remove a chisel stroke to keep a piece of their own humanity. There are symbols no one wants to carve, not because they're difficult, but because afterward they stay longer in the carver's mind than in the stone. That day began like any other, except for one thing. A cat appeared in the tomb, not a stray from the village, not a temple cat. The old worker muttered, Bastet doesn't always come to protect. Sometimes she comes to remind that someone has forgotten something. In Egyptian belief, cats are messengers of Bastet, a goddess of both gentleness and warning. If a cat appears among tomb workers, it means something has stepped out of order. And if it's a black cat, it usually isn't good news. This cat was jet black, eyes the color of copper, tail curved like a hooked staff. It walked slowly, among rubble, under dim oil lamps. It made no sound. You saw it while sharpening a small chisel. It looked at you for exactly 3 breaths, then turned away. An old worker whispered, Bastet sends messages, but not for everyone. That day, Kemu didn't come. The young apprentice who always told funny stories at lunch, who wore red cloth around his left wrist because Mom said it keeps me safe. No one saw him that morning. No one called his name. No one dared ask. Where's Kemu? In Deir el Medina. When someone doesn't return, people only whisper, he's been called. Not by guards, not by overseers, but by the thing no one wants to see and must never be named. The master said, maybe he got reassigned. But everyone knows. There are no other shifts in Deir el Medina. Someone silently placed their leftover bread on the stone where Kemu used to sit. No one touched it, no rat came near. In this village, bread left untouched is for the dead. Even if they haven't been declared gone, whoever eats it will dream someone else's dream. Someone once tried. For 3 nights, he dreamed of walking through a dark tomb, calling a name that never answered. Since then, the untouched bread became a silent ritual, not taught, not enforced, but understood by all. Midday. A small crack appeared on the west wall, where no one had touched for 3 weeks, a crack shaped like a raised arm, reaching for help. In Deir el-Medina, a crack is not just a mark of time. They say, a soul improperly sealed will leave behind a gap, a slit between stones in the shape of a figure. Once, a crack shaped like a foot made the whole crew stop for 3 days, because the overseer heard a soft breath in the night. The old worker who saw this one turned away, pulled out his cloth, wiped his face as if brushing off dust, but he never returned to that spot again. That night, as you washed your hands in the old basin by the porch, the black cat appeared again. It walked past your feet, no meow, no glance, then vanished behind the reeds near an unfinished tomb. You didn't tell anyone, just tied another red strip around your left wrist, as if something needed holding on. In Deir el-Medina, red isn't just a color, it's a charm. Kemu's mother once said, red hides you from demons. Red keeps your name out of the god of death's mouth. No one teaches you that in temple school, but anyone raised near tombs believes. And that night, not just you, by morning, at least 3 other workers wore red cloth on their wrists, quietly, without asking why. You carve all morning, the names of gods, the names of kings, the names of officials, even names longer than a curse. You've memorized every stroke of Ramses, Thutmose, and Horemheb, the way you know the placement of every callus in your palm. But no one carves your name, not because they forget, but because it's not allowed. In Deir el-Medina, there is a law that's never written. You must not carve your own name, not because of superstition, but because if you do, it means you've just marked your path into Duat. You've opened a door that should only ever open from the other side. In Deir el-Medina, a name is the most sacred thing. A name is what helps a soul find its way home. A name is what makes you exist after every cell has turned to dust. But some names have been erased. Someone once told a story about Akhenaten, the pharaoh whose name was scraped off every stone, as if he never existed. No name means no return. No name means no one remembers, and no one waits for you on the other side. And because of that, your name is only carved when someone wants you to live forever. You once carved your father's name on a small piece of stone buried under a fig tree. No one taught you to do that. You just didn't want him to drift from your memory. There was a time you tried to write your own name, not on stone, but on a broken piece of pottery, what people call an ostrakon. You used charcoal, a thin line, wrote it quickly, then hid it away. That night, you brought it out and smashed it, just to see. If my name breaks, will anything of me still remain? You once asked the master, will I ever get to carve my own name? He looked at you for a long time, then said, When someone needs to remember you, then yes. If not, then even if you carve it yourself, it's useless. A friend you worked with for 3 years died in a rockfall. No one wrote his name. You thought of carving a tiny mark on the back of a stone slab. But in the end, you only left a dot, as small as sand, and then sanded it away. Instead, you quietly placed a nameless Shabti figurine beneath the stone he used to work on. That statue was supposed to bear a name, but you left it blank. Not because you forgot, but because there was no one left to say that name out loud. You think, maybe when he reaches Duat, someone there will be holding a chisel, ready to finish what's missing. You know, a name isn't something to secretly write. A name is meant to be spoken. And if no one speaks it, then carving is not enough. Someone once misread Nebmat as Nemat, just one stroke different. The family said, for 3 nights, they heard gentle tapping on the walls, as if someone was trying to fix their name from the other side. You heard that story when you were 12, and since then, every time you carve a name, you pause 1 beat before the final stroke, just to be sure. Because if a name is misread, the soul will wander forever, never finding its way home. In the afternoon, you carve the name of an official who died 7 years ago, a name as long as a prayer. You carve every stroke, exact in order. In the end, someone asks, who will read it? You answer, no one has to, as long as Ra sees it. Then you lower your head, grab your chisel, and keep working, carving the names of others, preserving eternity for those who are called. As for your name, it still lies somewhere in your sleeve, uncarved, unspoken, and maybe it will never be written. That night, when you return to your room, you take a small piece of charcoal, your hand shaking as you draw a single dot on the mud wall. Not a name, not a symbol, just a dot. You stare at it for a long time, then wipe it away with your palm. And strangely, for the first time, you feel light. Maybe you don't need a name. Maybe all you need is someone who once tried to hold on to you. You step into the tomb while the sky is still dim. The lamps aren't fully lit yet. Breath still clings to the morning mist. Footsteps echo softly, and the stone walls on both sides haven't had time to absorb sound. No one says anything. No one greets. Only silence, thick like fog, heavy like stone that hasn't been carved. Yesterday, someone carved the wrong character. Just one. In the name of an official, a simple symbol, but placed incorrectly. No one scolded him, no whippings, but he didn't come back. His carving bench is still there, the dry bread unopened, the chisel handle still tilted, head pointing east, just as he always did. No one touches it, no one cleans it up. At Deir el Medina, people believe in the 7-day cycle. If a soul is lost, let it find its own way. For 7 days, no one is allowed to touch the belongings left behind by the missing. Not out of superstition, but out of respect. If the soul intends to return, it needs to see everything just as it was, so it won't be frightened. If not, then it's the soul's decision. No one has the right to call back a soul that isn't ready to return. The master carver simply placed a small stone over the chisel, then covered it with cloth. Not just any cloth. It was a piece of white funeral cloth from the last burial, kept for moments like this, used to close the chisel for those who don't make it back in time. No one touches that chisel handle again. To preserve the last handprint, so if the soul comes back, it won't see it's been replaced. It's not punishment, just to keep it that way, for the cycle to be complete. No one asks what cycle, because everyone knows 7 days. If within 7 days there's no news, no sign, his name will not be carved. Silence isn't the absence of sound. Silence here means everyone knows, understands, and agrees not to speak. A young apprentice who's only been here a few months naively asks, "How about we just recarve the letter and continue?" Someone inhales like they just swallowed sand. An old man smoothing a stone slowly shakes his head. No, you can never recarve the first letter. The first letter summons the soul. If it's wrong, you call the wrong one. If repeated, you open the wrong gate. Then he continues. Why not just recarve the letter and continue? Everyone pauses for half a beat. An old man answers, "Haven't you heard the tale of the Duat Gate? If the name is wrong, the soul won't be recognized. They'll stand forever at the gate, and if not called correctly, Apep will consume them." Apep, the serpent of chaos. It devours names, shadows, even memories. Egyptians believe the Duat is a place of order. Everything must be correct. The name, the syllable, the chisel's direction. If wrong, no one dares knock again. Because if one letter is wrong, the Duat may not recognize them. And if the Duat doesn't accept, that person will stand at the gate forever. No moving on, no returning. The young apprentice asks no more. He also never looks toward the covered chisel again. That night, 8 people in the workshop dream the same dream. No one says it out loud, but the next morning, they all look at each other for a long time. You see in their eyes what you saw in your own. A path of sand, endlessly long, no shadows, no sound. And in the middle, a chisel stabbed upright. No one dares touch it. No one dares speak. And no one sings the hymn that day. You don't know much about the man who carved wrong yesterday. Just remember the sound of him chuckling lightly while working, and how he often hummed an old hymn, always offbeat. Now, you feel silence. Not because there's no sound, but because that offbeat tune is gone. On normal days, everyone used to be annoyed by that off-key humming. But today, no one sings, not because it's forbidden, but because no one has enough breath left to pluck a sound in the air thick as morning robes. Silence doesn't just fill the tomb. It seeps into the cold rice, into the dim lamps, into every carved stroke, as if the stone itself is holding its breath with you. And you remind yourself, to hold the chisel is to hold someone else's memory. One wrong strike, it's not the stone that breaks, it's a soul lost. You inhale deeply. Your hand trembles slightly, and you continue carving, slowly, carefully, in silence. Thick, like uncarved stone. There's a corner of the workshop, rarely visited. It has no official name. People whisper and call it the side room, where the statues no one claims reside. They're not ugly, not broken either, but no one knows who carved them. No one remembers assigning the work. No orders, no recipient's name, no commissioner. And so, no one dares take them. No one dares destroy them either. You once went in, sent to fetch a stone block. The room smelled of not exactly mould, but like old breath that never fully left. The light was so faint that your shadow disappeared the moment you turned away. You saw a small statue, a man wearing a head wrap, arms stretched forward as if holding something, but there was nothing in his hands. You leaned in for a closer look. The carving was sharp, the technique careful. It even bore upward chiseling marks, the kind only used for statues made for burial rites. You stepped back, not out of fear, but out of confusion. If this is a ritual statue, why hasn't it been placed in a tomb? If it was unauthorized, why is it so detailed? And if no one carved it, why does the stone carry a human form? You told no one. But since then, you noticed. People say, if a soul is forgotten, it can't move forward, nor return. It wanders between the cracks, breathing in dust, and waits for someone, with trembling hands, to carve it in its place. If someone dies without being named, someone's hand will tremble and carve in their stead. They call it a self-born statue, when stone reveals form through unspoken longing. No one admits to carving, but the statue still appears. At each new moon, a small oil lamp is left in the room. No one asks who brings it. There's no ritual, no prayer, just a sliver of light, like a question mark no one dares to speak aloud. They call it the uninvited flame. For those souls no one remembers, no one calls, but who still stand there, waiting. Some statues have clear bodies, but no face, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, because if you carve the face wrong, the soul bears that face forever. Egyptians believe the face is the final path for the soul to recognize itself. No one dares to guess. And so, the faceless remain, nameless. Each month, a new statue appears in the side room. No one brings it, no one sees it placed, but it's always there every time you go for stone. The master said, there are souls not strong enough to demand their name. They just stand there, quietly, waiting for someone's hand to write them down. You asked, could it be? I once carved one, and don't remember. He looked at you, didn't smile, just said slowly, if you did, that's all right. As long as your hand didn't tremble. That night, you wrote your own name in charcoal on the floor, then erased it. Someone once said they carved a statue, then forgot. A few nights later, they dreamed they were still chiseling, even in sleep. Their hand kept moving in air, following the familiar rhythm. No sound, no stone, no voice calling. Only the carving hand, and a soul standing there. No eyes, no mouth, no name. Their name had been erased from the assignment list, but the statue remained, as if their hand never stopped working. No one confirmed it, but after that dream, they left the job, not out of fear, but because their hand could no longer tremble, could no longer leave a mark, only to know they still remembered. The next morning, a new statue had appeared. There's a legend. If someone, even just one, accidentally says the correct name of a nameless statue, the statue will step forward, not like a ghost or magic, but like a person who has found themselves again. A name is a key. Say it right, and every door opens. But saying the right name of a soul never written down, no one can be sure. No one trains to do that. Only those who have never stopped remembering someone. They are the last hope for the statues no one claims. You don't enter, you don't look, but you know. Some statues, according to old records, were once hidden forever if carved on unfavorable days. Days when the god Seth was believed to rule, or when the moon was faint and shapeless. Because it's believed, if a statue is carved on the wrong day, the soul inside will carry a misalignment with Ma'at and never return to the right place. Maybe those statues are in the side room, not because of wrong orders, but because of wrong timing. And wrong timing stays wrong forever. Some things have been called into form, but not yet called into name. There is a fear that craftsmen never speak aloud, not the fear of carving wrong lines, but the fear of being wrong just as everything seems complete. Because once a statue is carved, you can't truly undo it. One wrong chisel mark, a tilt in the wrong direction, a gaze looking slightly off, and the soul may never find its way to the right tomb. They call it the silent error. No one sees it right away. But years later, someone may die unable to close their eyes. You witnessed it once. A statue, fully finished, was suddenly halted during the inspection ritual. No clear reason. The priest simply placed his hand on the statue's forehead, then quietly shook his head. He didn't say what was wrong, only said, "This one will not be guided." And so the statue was taken to the side room. Not broken, not explained, just not used. Since then, you feared the mistakes no one talks about. You wondered, if there's a slight flaw in the form, who will notice first? If the expression causes the soul not to recognize itself, who's responsible? And if I don't recognize my own mistake, will anyone else? There's something people never say out loud, that during statue inspections, there is always someone standing far off, doing nothing, saying nothing, just watching. That person isn't from the Craftsman's Guild, nor a priest. They just stand there, studying each statue as if every glance asks, do you truly carry the shape of that person? They call them the watcher of mistakes, not to punish, but to warn before it's too late. And if they walk away before your work is done, it means the statue no longer needs to be checked, because the flaw lies deeper, so deep that even Ma'at can't set it right. You ask the master, how do I know if I carved it right? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took you to an old statue, covered in dust, a woman in a head wrap, holding a broken lotus blossom. This one was placed in the wrong direction, and because of that, the soul lost its path. No one made a technical mistake, but everyone misaligned its direction. That night, you dreamed. A statue stood with its back to you. You stepped forward, wanting to see its face. But the closer you came, The more the statue faded, you reached out to touch its shoulder, and your hand passed through stone. You woke up, cold to the core, and the next morning, on your workbench, was a small stone shard, claimed by no one. But on it, one word was carved: enough. There's an old legend whispered in the workshop. If a statue is moved 3 times before it leaves the shop, it must not carry a name, because the ancients believed a statue moved too many times has been called by a voice not of this world. Once, there was a statue from Amenhotep's time, carved with exquisite precision, but no matter where it was placed, its gaze seemed wrong. Set before a lamp, the shadows bent unnaturally. Placed near a wall, its ear turned to a direction no one understood. After 3 failed placements, the master ordered it destroyed, not because it was flawed, but because it no longer belonged to the realm of the living. Few know this, but before reaching the priest, each statue is tested in a strange way. An old craftsman breathes gently onto its face. If the statue is whole, he'll feel his breath bounce back, like a light breeze. If not, his breath will vanish into the stone as if it was never there. The ancients believed stone can receive breath. If a statue doesn't return it, no spirit will ever enter. And that statue, no matter how refined, will remain only a body of stone. From that, you understood. No one can be sure they've done everything right. You can only hope. If something is wrong, someone will notice in time. Perhaps that's why, before a statue leaves the workshop, a tiny groove is always carved into its ankle, not to attach anything, but as a reminder. Every human form, no matter how perfect, needs to be guided. And if something's wrong, you just hope you're not the last one to find out. During the day, you're the one carving, but at night, something switches roles. No one says it out loud, but every old craftsman knows. Statues look during the day to be checked, but at night, they look to check you. Ancient craftsmen's legends say statues during daylight aren't truly awake. They just open their eyes to learn posture, letters, and the carver's face. But when the sun sets, that's when the statue awakens. Not with eyes, but with memory. Veteran sculptors always avoid touching the face of a statue after dusk, because they believe if the statue is awake, it might mistake your hand as the final memory it needs to keep. When night falls on Deir el-Medina, the sound of chisels fades, the furnace fire dies down, the workshop goes so still you can hear your own fingers brushing wood. You stay later than usual. Maybe work's urgent, or maybe you just don't want to go home. But then you notice something. You weren't supposed to. A small statue, waist high, has turned its face toward you. You clearly remember placing it facing the door. Now, it's looking at your table. You say nothing. You just get up and turn it back around, then extinguish the oil lamp. The second time, when you return, the statue is looking at you again. This time, you don't turn it. You simply place your hand on its forehead, like a priest once did. No explanation. Just one question in your mind. If statues don't recognize the dead, why do they keep looking at the living? Some say statues without names often retain a piece of whoever touched them the most, not a curse. Not a haunting, just memory. A kind of memory that needs no brain, only stone. And if you once carved a statue too long, too carefully, too focused, sometimes you leave behind in it a trace of your gaze. From then on, you start noticing. Statues not yet finished, when viewed under moonlight, cast shadows that don't look human. Some seem to tilt their heads. Some appear to lean in to listen. You mention it to the master craftsman. He doesn't laugh, just nods, because nighttime is when statues begin learning souls. And sometimes, souls are the ones still alive. One night, you forgot your chisel. You go back and see a statue you know you haven't carved the eyes for. Yet, it looks at you, not with eyes, but with posture. Its whole body turned toward you, hands stacked as if ready to receive. You feel your breath catch, because that statue is of a young woman, and you once had a daughter who passed away last year. You turn away, but your feet won't lift from the floor, because a statue done right reminds you of an ideal. But a statue done wrong carries emotion, crooked and scarred, like a real person. There was once a statue abandoned for being carved without one ear. When a craftsman came to fix it, the entire workshop fell silent. Everyone felt something had been lost. That statue was stored away, not for its flaw, but because it had accidentally taken on the form of someone who once lived. Since then, you no longer look statues in the face at night, not out of fear, but out of respect. You understand, statues too need their own time to exhale who they are. And if they do look back at you, maybe it's just their way of asking, I will carry this form for 1,000 years. Are you sure this is the one worth remembering? You leave the workshop at midnight, the crescent moon hanging like a sickle above your head. You bring no chisel with you, only the gaze of stone. Next story, the archaic period around the 8th, 6th century BCE. The archaic period around the 8th, 6th century BCE. The archaic period of Greece, stretching from roughly the 8th to the 6th century BCE, was an era of recovery and renewal in culture and politics. It was the period during which Greece witnessed the rise of the polis, also known as independent city-states. Polis, such as Athens and Sparta, laid the foundation for the unique political systems of ancient Greece. Prologue. Echoes from the long night history doesn't begin in light. It often begins in darkness, where writing disappears, traditions are forgotten, and all that remains of humanity is a fading memory of a lost golden age. That was Greece after the 12th century BCE, a civilization that once built walls, erected palaces, and inscribed the names of gods onto clay tablets, now reduced to a torn canvas. The Mycenaean language fell silent. The stone corridors of the palace of Pylos were overrun by wind and weeds. People lived scattered, without writing, without carving, without knowing who they were in a world sinking into its own bottom. Without books, people folded memory into song to lull their children to sleep and to avoid forgetting themselves. Some still told stories. They wandered from village to village, carrying their lyres and epic tales now breathed through rhythm instead of lines. From their lips, a hazy world of Achilles, Hector. Odysseus came alive, not with accuracy, but with the will to keep from vanishing. And then something strange happened. Not a revolution, but a return, incomplete, as if the past came back, not to reign, but to be understood differently. The survivors of that long night began to relearn from scratch, to learn how to write their names, to learn how to tell stories with letters instead of breath. They didn't write the first epics in blood, but in longing, in the yearning to carve someone's name onto a piece of pottery, so it wouldn't be forgotten again. Around the 8th century BCE, faint signals began to sound, not from thrones, not from war horses, but from whispers by the hearth, a poem, a story, a song recalling a hazy war between the Greeks and the city of Troy, and above all, an urgent need to write it down. A new alphabet emerged, borrowed from the Phoenicians, but reshaped to fit voices, melodies, and an awakening self. For the first time, writing wasn't just for recording tribute or triumph, but for emotion, sorrow, and private memory. A woman on the island of Lesbos could write about loving another woman, and people read it, not to condemn, but to understand. A farmer could listen to tales of the harvest and find himself in the words of Hesiod. From a tool of kings, writing became a mirror held to the hearts of common people, a kind of writing not reserved for the ruling class, but for those who wanted to remember, to tell, to live. From here, Greece entered a slow, painful rebirth, known by historians as the Archaic period, not as glorious as the classical era, not as monumental as Homer's epics, but it was in this era that the first stones were laid for a culture that would shape the Western world for thousands of years. From small coastal villages, the polis were formed, each city-state a miniature world, with temples, public squares, laws, and its own dreams. People began joining councils, debating, writing poems about private sorrow. Stone statues began to resemble humans, not just gods. And poets like Sappho and Hesiod started speaking of love, labor, and loss, not with the voice of gods, but their own. In this journey of rebirth, Greece didn't just rediscover language and aesthetics. They gave birth to something never before seen in human history, a civilization that placed humans at its center. The history of archaic Greece is the history of questions. Who is a citizen? What is beauty? Who has the right to speak and be heard? And in asking those questions again, Greece stepped out of the shadows, not as an empire, but as a chorus of voices trying not to be forgotten. Rebirth never stands still. Just as the city-states were beginning to form, the Greeks did what their ancestors once feared. They left. Not all of them, but enough to mark an era of unprecedented expansion, an age where waves became roads, and distant harbors became second homes. The reason was painfully simple. Scarce land, a growing population. Civil wars and poverty left many families with nothing left to lose, except for the hope that beyond the horizon, things might be better. The narrow plains of Greece couldn't feed everyone. Young people left out of inheritance systems, with no land, no power, only two options, rebellion or departure. Many communities chose the latter. They left their villages with a mother's sigh, a father's downward gaze, and the promise that if they succeeded, they would send news. If not, they would become a name no one would speak again. so crude wooden boats, loaded with grain, olive oil, and undefined dreams, set out from the Gulf of Corinth, the island of Euboea, and even the small harbour of Phocaea. Where did they go? Not just to points on a map, but to new canvases, new chances, and unnamed challenges. Magna Graecia, southern Italy, where the red earth was fertile, but also fiercely contested by the Etruscans and Carthaginians. Sicily, a strategic gem in the Mediterranean, with rich harvests, but always under the shadow of port wars. The shores of the Black Sea, cold, remote, yet rich in grain, metal, and space for a community to rise from ash. Southern Italy, later called Magna Graecia, Sicily, where fertile fields could feed an entire new generation. And farther still, to the shores of the Black Sea, where snow fell, but there was still room for Greek-speaking people to carve their names into stone. Wherever the Greeks landed, they didn't just build houses. They rebuilt the polis, a miniature replica of home, with the agora, market, the Acropolis, temple, and new vows. They chose land by the sun's path, laid foundations with stone taken from the shore. Every settlement began with an altar, because without gods, no one could witness hope. The population was divided by tribe. Councils were formed, and laws carved onto wood or stone. Even with only a few dozen households, they held athletic games, taught children to write, and sang old songs from home as good luck charms. They brought with them Apollo, Athena, their language, their eating habits, and the silhouettes of parents left behind. But not all encounters were gentle. The Phoenicians were skilled negotiators. The Egyptians had their own pantheon, and the native Italic people looked at the new temples with a mix of curiosity and caution. Sometimes there was cooperation, shared ports, shared harvests, sometimes tension, conflicts over land, water, or whose god was stronger. The Greeks learned how to compromise. They didn't bring Zeus to conquer, but to coexist. And because of that, they changed in pottery, in storytelling, even in their concept of home. But they also learned how to live alongside Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Italic natives. They traded gold for glass, wine for temples, suspicion for understanding. The sea wasn't a boundary, it was a network. It connected the city-states, the past and the present. When a boy in Cyrene or Marseille learned the Greek alphabet, he didn't know he was continuing a current started by storytellers around a fire. That migration, which the Greeks didn't call imperialism but colonization, wasn't painted with ambition. It bore the shape of survival, but ended with a cultural web spanning the Mediterranean. Not every journey succeeded. Some communities vanished, were absorbed, or didn't survive their first winter. But what mattered is that they went and left their trace. It was an era when the sea called, and the Greeks answered in the language of hope. And the next generation, children born in Syracuse, Massalia, or Cyrene, grew up between two worlds of memory. They spoke Greek, read Homeric poetry, worshipped Apollo, yet never saw the sky over Euboea or tasted olives from the motherland. For them, homeland was a retold concept, a bedtime story passed down in repetition. But that repetition kept the roots from snapping. When they carved names into stone, they still used the Greek alphabet. When they wrote their first love letters, They still use the words Hesiod once used to describe labor and harvest. And in that way, the sea connected not just lands, but memory, language, and the identity of a civilization that never wanted to be forgotten. After the migrations, after temples were built and laws established, the Greeks returned to what was most essential, the voice, not the voice of gods or kings, but the whisper of each individual, the voice of the soul written down, read aloud and preserved. The 7th and 6th centuries BCE were the era of the poetic rise. But to reach that point, Greece had to undergo a deep social transformation. After the migrations, land distribution, and the shaping of the polis, people began to free themselves from the constraints of bloodlines and class. A new middle class emerged. Merchants, craftsmen, poets, teachers, those who did not rule but also did not remain silent. They lived not just by labor, but by thought, by inner conflict, and by the desire to express themselves. It was from this class that the individual self began to take shape, and a distinct voice began to rise, without waiting for permission from royalty. Gone were the long epics of heroes slaying monsters. Instead came short verses, full of questions, torment, rawness. The Greeks began to write about themselves, love, loneliness, youth, aging, even the feeling of being forgotten in a crowd. Hesiod didn't sing of victory. He wrote about labor, weather, and the toil of a farmer's life. He recorded the sowing seasons as a way to fight chaos, as if remembering the ploughing calendar could keep people from losing their way entirely. His poetry was a survival guide, but also the lament of someone too awake in an unjust world. No one had written like that before, not to honor anyone, but just to exist. Sappho didn't write of kings, but of missing a girl she could not touch. She was not just a poet, she was a phenomenon, a rare female voice in the ancient world, where women's voices were often drowned by the shouts of heroes and warriors. Her poems were fragments of emotion, fragile yet sharp, intimate yet unflinching. She wrote about same-gender love not to shock, but because it was real. And through that truth, Sappho created a space for those who had never been allowed to speak. Alcaeus didn't rally for war, but poured wine and asked, "How does one live rightly when all values fall apart?" For the first time in history, writing was used to ask questions instead of make proclamations. And from there, the individual awakened. No longer we in a choral collective, but I in authentic solitude. A silent revolution where people began to believe their voices were worth hearing. Writing in this era changed as well. Inscriptions were no longer proclamations from the state, but fragments of conversation, a marriage proposal, a proverb etched into a wine cup, a line of longing on a tombstone. It appeared everywhere, regardless of class. A potter could sign his name on the base of a jar. A heartbroken soul could carve a few words onto a street column. There were even poetic exchanges written on drinking cups, one person writing a line, the next replying with the next verse. Writing became conversation, became play, became instant expression, like the first social network carved into clay. Words were no longer just tools, they became windows into the soul, and from that, art blossomed. On pottery, people painted scenes of daily life, of lovemaking, of drinking, of sorrow. In music, laments were composed using island scales, melodies sad but airy. Language was no longer a weapon, but a refuge. And in music, the self found its form. Lyres strummed at fairs, double flutes echoed through valleys, no longer meant to glorify victory, but to tell a love story, a memory, or something still unspoken. Poetry was sung by common people at local festivals where there was no audience, only those who understood. There, emotions needed no polishing, only truth. Greeks of this era didn't need glory to become immortal. They needed a poem. Has anyone, like me, loved and feared, sung and fallen silent, and still remained present in a single line of text? And perhaps that very question is what made the archaic period of Greece not just a transitional phase, but a quietly beating heart between two worlds, a heroic past and a radiant future, stone. And in stone, they carved themselves, both literally and in the most abstract sense. In the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, sculpture and architecture were not just techniques, but a form of asking, what is a human? What does a god look like? And can beauty be measured by proportion? They created the kouros, young men standing straight, arms relaxed, one foot lightly stepping forward as if testing a move beyond the mold. If Egyptian statues symbolized eternity, unchanging, unmoving, then kouros was the first expression of a desire for motion. Even if the foot hadn't truly left the block of stone, that gesture carried a silent message. I am alive. I am moving forward. Kouros was not a god, but a young person trying to name themselves through form. And kore, girls with strange smiles, stiff pleated dresses, hands often holding offerings. Unlike kouros, nude to show strength, kore was always clothed, not because the technique wasn't ready, but because prejudice was still thick. Women, even as statues, were bound by the mold of gentleness, obedience, silence. Kore did not step forward, only stood, did not look straight, only smiled. But even within that frame, beauty still escaped, as if stone too knew how to sigh. These statues were not as lifelike as those that came later, but they were the first voice of a desire to define humanity through the body, though clumsy, rigid, like a soul not yet freed from stone. Unlike Egyptian statues, symbolic and immutable, archaic Greek sculpture sought a sense of motion. Though the wide eyes were lifeless and the archaic smile was stiff, each kouros was a rough draft of something very real, the idea of the individual. That smile, half an effort to live, half an awkward expression of aesthetics, was not to show happiness, but a first attempt to make statues less like corpses. Between the lifelessness of stone and the vitality of the living, they chose to smile, even if it was just a hesitant curve, as if wanting the statue not just to stand, but to be present, no longer the perfect mold of the divine, but the village boy, the young soldier, the athlete about to enter the Olympia. Beauty no longer belonged only to gods. It could be cast by human hands. Alongside sculpture, architecture began to build temples not just to house gods, but to assert the identity of a community. Doric columns, strong, simple. Ionic columns, slender, with spirals like flowing hair. Corinthian columns, ornate, shaped like leaves. Each style was a declaration. This is our city-state, our God, our aesthetic. And for the first time, beauty was no longer a luxury hidden in palaces, but placed in the public square, the temple, where anyone could see, enter, and feel, no longer confined by class. Beauty became a public experience, as if ancient Greece was saying, "We don't just believe in gods, we believe in the light shining on human faces." And most remarkable of all, these buildings weren't just made for gods to look upon, but for mortals to walk into. From the stone steps to the wide porticos, everything was measured by the human foot. The human body's proportions became the standard. From that point, Greece didn't just build temples, they built beauty in their own image. It was the era when humans, for the first time, began to see themselves as a worthy model to imitate. Stone statues didn't just honor, they reflected. Temples didn't just block the rain, they elevated belief. And stone, the most inanimate thing, suddenly became witness to a burning question. If gods can look like humans, can humans become divine? Of debt, and amidst lawsuits over land, the Greeks began to ask themselves, who decides? Who represents us? And is the law merely the voice of the powerful? The 7th, 6th centuries BCE were the era when the first political institutions of Greece were formed, not on paper, but on stone, in the agora, and through conflict. From clan-based aristocrats, where power was concentrated in the hands of long-established families, the Greeks began witnessing a shift in power. As merchants grew rich from trade, as craftsmen gathered into guilds, and as farmers, those who carried the weight of production, were pushed into corners by debt, resentment began to build. In that context, certain individuals, called the first lawgivers, stepped forward, not as revolutionaries, but as organizers of chaos. Elsewhere, class conflict was no longer vague. A wealthy aristocrat, used to handling all disputes behind closed doors, over wine and handshakes, now had to go to the marketplace, where the law was read aloud before commoners. He frowned. The privileges he once held, verdicts, immunity, access to information, now lay etched onto a stone tablet in the square. At the same time, a poor farmer, once enslaved for a small debt, heard rumors of a man named Solon considering debt cancellation. He didn't believe it, but he also didn't dare to hope. Both, the one above and the one below, saw the old order trembling. And in that very moment, law ceased to be the property of a class and became a battlefield. But among those writing the laws, there was still a group never invited to the table. Women, slaves, immigrants. No one asked what they wanted. No one wrote laws for them, only upon them. A woman stood at the edge of the agora, hearing laws read aloud, but knowing her name was not in them. A slave carried water across the square, hearing debates about rights and wondering, am I counted as human? Ancient politics was not born from inclusion, but from exclusion. And those silenced voices, though quiet, still simmered, like fire beneath ash. Imagine a day in Athens. You're a potter. In the morning, you go to the market, where a new stone tablet has been placed, covered in clauses you can't finish reading. Someone nearby reads aloud, "He who steals goods at the market shall be executed." You freeze, still holding the freshly fired pot. Not because you planned to steal, but because you just saw a poor man snatch a loaf of bread. In the past, that could be negotiated. Now, it's law. You don't know whether to feel safe or afraid, because for the first time, the law is no longer something someone yells in anger. It is something fixed, carved in stone, cold and unfeeling. Before the law was carved in stone, it lived in words and in glances. You were punished not for what you did, but for what a nobleman felt was wrong. A glance, a frown, could decide your family's fate. Law existed, but nowhere, unwritten, unconfirmed, unchallenged. It was a kind of wordless law, solemn, vague, and unspoken. That's why, when Draco carved laws into stone, even though they were harsh, people called it progress, because at least, for the first time, the law could be seen. Before Draco acted, pause at that moment, when people first saw a stone tablet with writing. You think you'd feel relieved, but no. You feel a chill down your spine, because from now on, you can't pretend not to know. You can't blame anyone. You can't plead. The law sits there before your eyes, like a sentence waiting. And strangely, there's something like respect, not because the law is fair, but because it exists and everyone can see it. Draco and the terror of writing in Athens. Draco was the first to write laws into text around 621 BCE. Before that, laws were passed down orally, often shifting with a nobleman's whim. Draco wrote laws in stone, and for that, they were as rigid as stone. His laws were so infamous that the word draconian still exists today. Petty theft, death penalty, unpaid debt, enslavement. And yet strangely, people thank Draco because he made the law equal in its cruelty. No one could claim I didn't know the law, because it was now carved where anyone could read it, if literate. Solon and the boldness of mercy in the next generation. Solon, a poet, an aristocrat, and a clear-eyed man, did what few dared. He cancelled debts. He banned enslaving people for debt, redistributed power based on income instead of bloodline. For Solon, the law wasn't just a warning, but a chance to correct. He opened the Citizens' Council, allowed more social groups to participate in politics, and turned Athens from a stratified city-state into a place of open debate. Not everyone was pleased. The rich were angry, the poor disappointed. It didn't go far enough. But Solon planted a seed that laws could be rewritten. And from there, the idea of primitive democracy began to sprout. Tyrant, not a tyrant. During this period, another phenomenon emerged. Tyrants, leaders who gained power through public support, not aristocratic lineage. Today, the word is negative, but back then, a tyrant was someone who broke the cycle, often from the middle class, brave enough to speak for common frustration. Some became oppressive, but many, like Pisistratus in Athens, invested in culture, religion, infrastructure, and nurtured poetry. A tyrant was like a road clearer, smashing the old structure to prepare for a new system, one later called democracy. The archaic period didn't immediately invent democracy, but it did create questions. Who gets to write the law? Who gets to protest? Who gets to be represented? And most importantly, is law meant to rule or to protect? In a crowded marketplace, Someone reads aloud a law carved in stone. Another nods. Someone else shakes their head. And from that, politics is born, not from a throne, but from voices between people. The ancient Greeks did not live without gods, but they also didn't live with a rigid doctrinal system. The gods, in their world, were not distant, cold powers residing on Mount Olympus. They were entities with moods, love, hatred, jealousy, vengeance, sometimes like parents, sometimes like eccentric neighbors, and at times like themselves, just more powerful, more immortal. In the 8th-6th centuries BCE, gods were no longer just thunder, rain, or invisible land. They began to take faces and bodies like humans. Zeus had a wandering eye. Hera got jealous. Ares was aggressive. Aphrodite blushed in front of a mirror. In statues, the gods began to have ideal human proportions. In poems, they also started arguing over romance. And in folk tales, they failed, made mistakes, and got punished. This humanization made faith less foreign and softer, like a scarf passed down through 3 generations. Sometimes, prophecy wasn't meant to give answers, but to make humans confront themselves. A leader heard an oracle about collapse. He could take it as a warning for peace, or use it as an excuse to strike first. From there, prophecy did not bind, but opened a grey area. And in that grey area, humans had the right to interpret and had to live with the consequences of their choices. The gods weren't hiding the truth, but humans had to accept that. Misunderstanding was part of belief. The Greeks didn't go to temples just to beg. They went to ask questions. At Delphi, the temple of Apollo, god of light and prophecy, welcomed thousands from across the Mediterranean. No one knew exactly what the answer would be, but everyone knew. It was always a vague poem. If you cross the river, an empire will fall. But which empire? Sometimes, the question itself became the prophecy. Religion, once a place of petition, gradually became a way for humans to look within, a way to take responsibility or to shift blame, depending on interpretation. Not all faith existed in temples, in narrow alleys, coastal villages, places with no white marble or columns. Greeks still worshipped in their own way. A piece of bread on the doorstep, a jar of cool water buried under a tree, a red thread tied around a child's wrist. These weren't rituals, but habits soaked through generations. They believed in the well spirit, the tree spirit, the hearth goddess. No names in history books, no statues for worship, but called upon daily with little prayers. May the well not dry, may the fire not die, may the baby sleep well. Folk belief, therefore, was a wordless religion. No robes or trumpets, just remembering and repeating. Not every god was honored with grand temples and festivals. Hestia, goddess of the sacred flame and hearth, had no temple, but she was in every kitchen. Greeks whispered her name before each meal, each journey, each voyage. Faith sometimes didn't need music or wine, just a small flame that never went out. The paradox, in mythology, goddesses were powerful. Athena, Artemis, Demeter, Persephone. But in real life, women couldn't speak in the agora, couldn't write laws, couldn't serve as high priestess, except for rare exceptions. Faith was the only place women were allowed to appear, but only as images. They were sculpted, worshipped, named, but not allowed to tell their own stories. A girl prayed to Demeter for crops, but she couldn't own the land. She could only hope, like Persephone, dragged into the underworld, then released, once a year, like a cycle of powerlessness framed as a festival. Dionysus wasn't just the god of wine, he was god of theatre, performance, and unspeakable emotions. During the Dionysia festival, Greeks didn't just drink, they performed. They cried through tragedy. They laughed through comedy. They screamed instead of praying. And through horns, chants, shouts and tears, a society bound by law, gender, class, was unlocked for a day. A slave became a king. A woman got to speak on stage. A child played the god of death. Every role was allowed, as if only in intoxication one could be honest. The festival, then, was not just religion, it was therapy, a collective mirror, a confession in costume. There was no Bible, no priesthood system. Greek religion existed as a network of retellings. Each region had its own version, its own interpretation. Zeus in Athens wasn't the same as Zeus in Crete. Some places didn't even worship Zeus, but his mother. No one forced you to believe the right way. You just had to keep telling the stories. A whisper in a son's ear before battle. A lyre tune when the wind rose. A dried laurel branch behind the door to remind we were once protected. Statues of gods weren't just symbols, they were keepsakes of belief. A statue of Apollo with wide open eyes, not in surprise, but because he never closed his eyes to humanity. A core with a gentle smile, like holding back an unspoken prayer. The Greeks didn't create the gods, they remembered them, in body, in sound, in gestures repeated for generations, like a familiar prelude. Across the ancient world, many civilizations worshipped gods. But what made Greek religion different? No original sin, no atonement by blood, no mandatory salvation. The Egyptians worshipped Ma'at's absolute balance. The Jews trusted a covenant with a single God. The Babylonians recorded sins and virtues like merchant ledgers. But the Greeks, they told stories. And in every story, each person found their own reason to keep believing. No one needed to be right. They just had to feel seen. Their religion, in the end, wasn't a system of belief, but a stage where imagination and memory lived together. The farther they travelled, the more the Greeks brought gods along. But the gods also changed along the journey. Dionysus in the colonies became a healing god. Athena by the coast was given wings. New gods were born, not from Olympus, but from the hearts of people in need. Faith, in that way, wasn't fixed. It was like a stream, flowing through centuries, through wars, through longing. It didn't have to be right, it just had to not be forgotten. If Athens is the center of light, then its shadows fall upon those who never set foot in the agora. They are women, slaves, and foreigners. Three groups forming the backbone of society, yet voiceless in history. No one recorded the feelings of a girl forced to leave her home to marry a man she had never met. No one asked the opinion of a slave sold from one island to another. No one allowed a foreigner, even one who lived their entire life in Athens to be called a citizen. They were everywhere, but their voices were always replaced by the silent sound of footsteps. Athenian wives were not permitted to study philosophy, walk alone on the streets, or stand before the council. Yet, they were expected to keep the family hearth burning, bear sons, and teach their children to fear the gods and love the city-state. You lived like a shadow, cherished like an ancient vase, but never allowed to choose where to place yourself. Goddesses could wield thunderbolts, but you could only pray to them to survive. They were those captured in war, sold in markets, or born to mothers without freedom. No one asked if they wanted to be potters, rowers, or nurse their master's children. They cleaned Athens' trash, transcribed texts for philosophers, raised noble children. But they were not allowed to attend festivals for citizens. They might have known more than their masters, but that knowledge was unacknowledged. They loved, hurt, remembered, dreamed, but were nameless in poetry. You could live in Athens for 40 years, run a shoe shop, raise 3 children, but if your parents weren't Athenian, you remained a metoikos. Sometimes, a foreign child would ask their father, "Am I Athenian?" And he would just look out the window without answering. Because even if you knew every street, every market corner, every season's wind, you still had no right to vote, no land ownership, no marriage to an Athenian citizen without special permission. You existed, but were uncounted. You were attached, but unnamed. You had no right to vote, no land ownership, no marriage to an Athenian citizen without special permission. You knew every street, every market corner, every season's wind, but you belonged nowhere except under the label, the other. The outsiders did not disappear. They were present in every social activity. They taught, farmed, sang, told stories, built houses, babysat, cleaned battlefields, delivered babies. But Greek history did not record them as characters, only as conditions of existence. Religion gave them some presence. Festivals gave them a day to dress up. Poetry occasionally wrote about them, but in someone else's voice. And if they told their own stories, only the wind heard. Or a reader 2,000 years later. Before the right to vote, Greeks had arguments. Before a parliament, they had markets. And before democracy, they had the first flashes, fragmented, chaotic, but blazing like lightning against a dark sky. Athens was once ruled by kings, then by aristocrats, then by land-owning families. Each power shift shook the city-state. The poor had no voice. The rich spoke for the entire village, and those in between were often stuck. Some years, land was taken. Some years, people were sold into slavery for debt. Some years, people revolted, but had no leader, until a man named Solon appeared. Not a philosopher, not a general. Solon was a poet, but he was chosen to rewrite all of Athens' laws because he understood human emotions. He banned selling citizens into slavery for debt. He divided people into 4 wealth-based classes, not by lineage. He opened the council to those not aristocrats. He didn't eliminate poverty, but he erased the feeling of hopelessness. And that was enough to prevent Athens from exploding. not just a reformer. Cleisthenes was also a victor in a silent war against the conservative aristocracy. After years of Athens being torn between major clans, he used his reforms as a cut into the old power system. He didn't overthrow by force, he overthrew by redesign. Cleisthenes reorganized all of Athens into 10 new units, not by clan, not by old territories, but by mixing. And then he proposed a strange mechanism: democratic ostracism. Each year, citizens would write the name of the person they wanted to leave the city. Whoever received the most votes would be exiled for 10 years. No trial, no explanation. Just because people didn't want to see your face anymore. It was strange, cruel, but also a way Athens maintained peace, through mutual fear. Not just a reformer, Cleisthenes was also a victor in a silent war against the conservative aristocracy. After years of Athens being torn between major clans, he used his reforms as a cut into the old power system. He didn't overthrow by force, he overthrew by redesign. Cleisthenes reorganized all of Athens into 10 new units, not by clan, not by old territories, but by mixing. 50 years after Solon, Athens was still unsettled. Tyrants rose to power, factions fought, civil wars erupted. Then Cleisthenes appeared and did something no one expected. Reorganized all of Athens into 10 new units, not by clan, not by old territories, but by mixing. Each unit included city dwellers, coastal residents, and mountain folk. Each person, for the first time, felt they belonged to something larger than family. And from there, people began to vote. Nyx, a small hill, no temple, no throne, just a podium, and hundreds sitting around. Anyone who was a citizen could speak. Anyone who misspoke was booed. Anyone who persuaded was chosen as general, judge, representative. Athenian democracy wasn't a rosy dream. It was noisy, exhausting, sometimes full of injustice. But for the first time, people didn't just live in the city-state. They lived in each other's opinions. Women could not speak. Slaves could not listen. Foreigners could not be present. Greek democracy was democracy for citizens. And the definition of citizen was a privilege with limits. But even if incomplete, it was still a spark, a first whisper. Perhaps the people should decide their own fate. The young democracy had barely caught its breath when war came knocking. Not an internal revolt, but the Persian Empire, a tidal wave from the east. Before Persia, Athens was nothing. A small city-state, lacking horses, lacking gold, lacking even unity. Persia had 100,000 troops. Athens, only 10,000. Persia had a massive fleet. Athens had just finished building a few triremes. But what Athens had was a reason not to disappear. In 490 BCE, Persian forces landed at the Bay of Marathon. Athens sent troops, not waiting for Sparta, not waiting for reinforcements. They fought, and they won. Not because they were many, but because they had no choice. A soldier ran from Marathon to Athens 42 kilometers just to announce, "We won," then collapsed and died. His name is forgotten, but his footsteps are retraced every year. After Marathon, Athens knew Persia would return. Themistocles, a strange politician, persuaded the people to use their silver to build a fleet instead of dividing it. He wasn't a hero, he was pragmatic, but that pragmatism saved Athens. He laid the foundation for Athens' navy, and when Persia returned with double the force, Athens was no longer prey. Before the great battle broke out, Athens was empty. No sound of hammers, no children playing, no smoke rising from kitchens. The people left the city, not to flee, but to go to sea and fight. An old man buried a jar of wine in the ground before boarding. If I survive, I'll come back to drink it. A mother tied a red string around her child's neck, whispering, if we're separated, follow the scent of salt. They all carried Athens not in bricks, but in promises. In 480 BCE, the naval battle of Salamis broke out in a narrow strait where the Persian fleet couldn't maneuver. 300 Athenian ships faced thousands of Persian warships. But the sea doesn't choose the stronger side. The sea chooses the side that understands it better. Athens won, not just with ships, but with the unity of people who, for the first time, knew they had a voice. That same year, in the north, 300 Spartan warriors held the line at Thermopylae and died to inspire. At Salamis, the Athenian citizens didn't all die. They survived. And survival meant they could keep telling the story. Thermopylae is a monument to defiance. Salamis is proof that democracy can also be strategic. One chose a beautiful death, one chose a long survival, and both kept Greece from being swallowed. In 480 BCE, Athens emptied the city. Everyone took to the ships. The people didn't flee, they fought. And the naval battle of Salamis broke out in a narrow strait where the Persian fleet couldn't maneuver. 300 Athenian ships faced thousands of Persian warships. But the sea doesn't choose the stronger side. The sea chooses the side that understands it better. Athens won, not just with ships, but with the unity of people who, for the first time, knew they had a voice. That same year, in the north, 300 Spartan warriors held the line at Thermopylae and died to inspire. At Salamis, the Athenian citizens didn't all die. They survived, and survival meant they could keep telling the story. Thermopylae is a monument to defiance. Salamis is proof that democracy can also be strategic. One chose a beautiful death, one chose a long survival, and both kept Greece from being swallowed. In 480 BCE, Athens emptied the city. Everyone took to the ships. The people didn't flee, they fought. And the naval battle of Salamis broke out in a narrow strait where the Persian fleet couldn't maneuver. 300 Athenian ships faced thousands of Persian warships. But the sea doesn't choose the stronger side. The sea chooses the side that understands it better. Athens won, not just with ships, but with the unity of people who, for the first time, knew they had a voice. No one believed that a democracy still in its infancy could survive the greatest invasion of its time. But from ashes and sea mist, Athens stepped into its golden age. The age of philosophy, theatre, art, and science began with a battle they were supposed to lose. Salamis, therefore, is not just a military victory. It is the moment when citizens realized history doesn't sleep on marble. It lives in the voices that still echo through theatre, through books, through constitutions. and through the questions humans still keep asking. When the dust of Salamis settled, Athens didn't just survive, they stepped into a golden age. The 5th century BCE, known as the Golden Age of Athens, a city-state that nearly vanished from the map, now became the center of philosophy, art, and politics in the ancient world. Pericles built the Parthenon. Euripides wrote tragedies. Socrates asked questions. And citizens, for the first time in human history, learned how to govern themselves by debate. No one was always right, but everyone had the right to speak. When you stand in a museum, looking at a Kouros statue with wide open eyes and a discreet smile, you're not just looking at a sculpture. You're looking at a world learning to define being human, a world still full of injustice, of imposed order, but already dreaming of beauty, dreaming of reason, dreaming of a society where people could argue for their future. Not everyone basked in the light. Women, slaves, foreigners still stood outside the circles of speech. Greek democracy was reserved for a chosen few, but even so, it was the first beam of light in a long night of despotism. The world would later learn and revise, take inspiration and challenge, receive and argue. And that's the most beautiful thing ancient Greece left behind, a legacy that isn't sealed. When you ask, should we listen to each other? You are speaking the language of Athens. When you stand in court and demand justice, even knowing no one may listen, you are standing alongside thousands who once climbed the steps of the Pnyx. When you argue about beauty, about the self, about truth, you are in conversation with Socrates, not because you agree with them, but because they ask the questions humanity has never stopped asking again. Not everyone survived that age. Not everyone was named. But from the stones, the poems, the etched lines, we hear one thing. They tried to build a society based on reason, tried to tell stories through marble and comedy, tried to create a world where even the gods had to join the debate. And so, the legacy of ancient Greece doesn't lie in being perfect, but in the fact that they began and dared to let what they began be continued by others. Athens left behind rocky hills where citizens once debated, left behind knife-scratched pottery shards, inscribed with names of those exiled for the common good, left behind the script of the first tragedy, the first constitution, the somber melody of a song no one remembers how to sing. But they didn't leave an apology, didn't leave a place for the outsiders, didn't leave a will to the world saying, do it differently. And so, maybe we are the part they left unfinished. We tell the story again, so they're not silent forever. We edit, not because we're better, but because they didn't have time. History is not a final engraving. It is a draft, handwritten by humans, with tears, with questions they didn't dare voice. The true legacy is not what's finished, but what's never been finished.